I was standing in the small, glass-walled office of the regional bank when the young associate returned. Her expression tightened in a way she didn't quite know how to hide. She had stepped away only to double-check a routine verification, as she put it. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. I had only come in to close the last piece of business tied to my late husband's estate, something I'd been told, repeatedly and confidently, had already been fully settled. But when she sat down across from me, her fingers trembling just slightly on the keyboard, she asked a question that struck with the quiet force of a wrecking ball. "Mrs. Alderton, has anyone ever mentioned a secondary account under your Social Security number?" I froze. "A what?" She turned the monitor slightly toward me, her voice softening. "A dormant account. It hasn't been touched in over 8 years. But it shows substantial activity before that. Withdrawals. Transfers. Several large transactions." My breath snagged in my throat. 8 years. Predating my husband's death. Predating the endless assurances from my stepchildren that everything had already been liquidated, divided, and finalized. I stared at the numbers on the screen, my Social Security number linked to an account I had never opened, never used, and certainly never authorized. "I'm sorry," she added, "but given the balance and the history, this should have been disclosed to you during probate." A strange ringing filled my ears. I remembered every conversation after my husband's passing, every slick explanation from his son-in-law, every document I was discouraged from reading too closely. I remembered being told I was lucky to have anything left at all. But this was different. "Can you print that?" I asked, my voice suddenly steady. "Every page." As the printer clicked to life behind her, I felt the first stirrings of something sharp and electric in my chest, not grief, not confusion, but clarity. Someone had lied to me. And someone had stolen from me. As the stack of papers slid into my hands, warm from the machine, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: this discovery was only the beginning. The truth had been buried, but it had not stayed dead. Now it was rising, and so was I. The associate looked at me, waiting for my reaction, perhaps expecting shock or panic. Instead, I gave her a calm nod. "Thank you," I said. "You've helped me more than you know." But even I did not yet understand just how much that quiet revelation would unravel, and just how far I would go to uncover every last thread. "My name is Margaret Alderton, and I am 66 years old. I have lived long enough to witness the end of a marriage, the pain of widowhood, the complicated shapes that families take, and the thousand small betrayals that people excuse because they don't know how to confront the truth. I grew up in a world where women were trained to be pleasing, quiet, grateful for whatever scraps financial institutions or difficult relatives tossed their way. I learned to keep binders of records, envelopes of receipts, folders of clipped statements, because I discovered early on that paper forgets nothing even when people do. For most of my life, I was an administrative coordinator for a medical office, a job that demanded precision, patience, and the ability to keep my composure under pressure. I wasn't extraordinary in any glamorous way, but I was reliable. Steady. Capable. Those who underestimated me usually did so only once. Yet marriage softened me. Love softened me. My late husband, Charles, was charming in that weathered, silver-haired way men eventually grow into. He was older than I was, gentle, fond of business ventures I never quite understood but trusted because I trusted him. When he passed, 7 years ago, it wasn't the money I missed, it was the companionship, the quiet reassurance of someone who walked beside me through life. But grief is not the only thing that deepens with age. Wisdom does, too. And survival. I had believed his children, grown adults who had always treated me with polite distance, when they assured me that all accounts were settled and the estate had been divided as their father intended. I accepted the modest inheritance because I valued peace more than conflict. I assumed the numbers were small because Charles's businesses had been struggling near the end. I assumed the omissions were accidental, not deliberate. But when the bank associate asked me about that dormant account, something ancient in me awakened. That administrative coordinator who never let a single form go unsigned or a single number remain unverified. That widow who had survived every kind of emotional storm. That woman who had been underestimated too many times to count. I don't frighten easily anymore. I learned, somewhere between 50 and 60, that the worst things in life are often the ones you accept without question. And the most dangerous people are the ones you think you're supposed to trust. So when I left the bank that afternoon, clutching those pages, I did not feel afraid. I felt something far more powerful. I felt ready. Still, I had no idea what kind of storm I was about to step into, and no idea how deeply the betrayal ran, or how many hands had been inside the pockets of my future. Charles had 2 children from his first marriage, Emily, the dutiful daughter who could smile kindly while dismissing you entirely, and Benjamin, whose charm felt like a borrowed suit he never learned to tailor. They were polite to me for the years I was married to their father, though I always sensed a thin membrane of resentment beneath their conversations. I wasn't their mother, and I had not joined the family early enough for them to consider me anything more than the woman who made their father happy at a time they felt he should have been focusing on legacy and inheritance. When he passed, Emily stepped into her self-appointed role as executor with the brisk decisiveness of someone who had been preparing for it. Her husband, Trevor, was a financial advisor, or at least that was the title he used most often. In practice, I never understood exactly what he did, only that he had long conversations with Charles in the office off the den, conversations that ended in tight handshakes and forced smiles. During probate, the 3 of them, Emily, Benjamin, and Trevor, presented me with a tidy stack of documents. They guided me through each page with rehearsed patience, explaining that Charles had fewer assets left than anyone expected. Investments had dissolved. Accounts had been liquidated to pay unresolved business debts. It was all very unfortunate, they said, but at least I would keep the house and a small savings cushion. They spoke in that tone people use when they believe they're doing you a kindness while quietly congratulating themselves for their honesty. I believed them. I let them handle everything because grief had hollowed me out and I couldn't imagine that the children of the man I loved would take advantage of me. I even thanked them for making the process so painless, a phrase that haunts me now like laughter in the dark. But looking back, I can trace the tension lines now, the way Emily avoided eye contact when I asked certain questions, the way Benjamin's foot tapped under the table during the signing, the way Trevor angled documents just slightly out of my reach before sliding them over for a signature. And now, with those dormant account records in my bag, I felt the first sting of an old truth: sometimes family is the sharpest blade, and the cuts they leave take longest to heal. Yet I also remembered something else, something Charles had told me only once, almost in passing. He'd mentioned having a project fund years ago, something private, something he had written off after business slowed. He said it wasn't much, not worth discussing. At the time, I let the comments slip through my fingers like sand. But what if it had never disappeared? What if someone else had made it disappear, at least on paper? As I sat at my kitchen table that evening, spreading the printed bank statements into a timeline, one unsettling detail began to surface: the dates of the withdrawals lined up perfectly with the months leading up to Charles's final illness. And someone had been moving money fast. I spent the next morning reading the statements line by line, tracing every withdrawal, every transfer, every unnerving pattern. The account had been opened nearly 15 years ago, and though the early deposits were sporadic, something changed 8 years before Charles died. Larger sums appeared. Regular withdrawals followed, always in even amounts: 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, never irregular, never spontaneous, the way a person might pull money for household needs. These were systematic. But it was the routing information that made my stomach drop. Several transfers went directly into an account with initials I recognized instantly. T. H. Alderton. Trevor Harrison Alderton. Emily's husband. The man who had guided me through the estate settlement with gentle condescension. The man who had assured me that every account had been liquidated, every dollar accounted for, every last piece of financial sediment sifted and explained. He hadn't just lied. He had stolen. And he had done it using my social security number. My hands trembled, not with fear but with a cold clarity. Identity theft was not a misunderstanding. Embezzlement was not an accident. Fraud was not a family disagreement, it was a crime with teeth. Every missing dollar, every quiet transfer, it all began to form a single, damning picture. Trevor had discovered the dormant account long before I ever knew it existed, siphoned funds into his own holdings, and then buried the entire paper trail under the guise of liquidation during probate. He hadn't simply taken what he believed he deserved, he had taken what he believed I would never notice. But the deeper betrayal, the one that pressed on my ribs until it hurt, was realizing that Emily and Benjamin must have known. They were too involved, too quick with explanations, too insistent that everything was already handled. They had watched me sign documents with trembling hands, watched me accept far less than I was entitled to, watched me thank them for their help. And they had let me walk away in ignorance. The page in front of me blurred for a moment as I felt something like grief, raw and unexpected. Not for the money, but for the trust one had extended so willingly. For the kindness I had offered. For the family I had believed I was part of, even if only distantly. But grief, I've learned, is a temporary visitor. It arrives, it takes what it needs, and then it steps aside for something stronger. Resolve. I closed the folder slowly, deliberately, like sealing a vault door. If they had assumed I would never uncover the truth, that assumption was about to become their greatest mistake. I began my investigation the way I approached everything difficult in my life, with method, patience, and a clean dining room table. I created labeled folders, transfers, statements, probate filings, comparisons, signatures, because I knew that the truth is easiest to see when placed in order. I pulled every estate document from the file cabinet where I'd stored it 7 years earlier, unfolding each page as if it were a relic. The signatures caught my eye first, Trevor's neat, practiced lines, my own wavering script, and the notary's stamp that suddenly felt complicit. Then I saw something that made my jaw tighten, an asset disclosure summary with a list of accounts attributed to Charles. The dormant account was not on it. Not even as a closed entry. It had been omitted entirely. That wasn't a mistake. That was intentional concealment. I made an appointment with attorney Lila Patterson, a woman recommended by a neighbor who whispered conspiratorially that Lila was the kind of lawyer who could make a shark nervous. When I met her in her minimalist office, she gave me a long, assessing look, one woman of a certain age evaluating another, measuring resilience. "What brings you in today?" she asked. I laid the folders on her desk and spoke clearly. The estate was mishandled. And I believe funds were stolen. Lila flipped through the documents, eyebrows lowering with each page. "This is extensive," she murmured. "You did all this on your own?" "I worked administration for 40 years, I said. "Paperwork doesn't scare me." She gave a small, approving nod. "Mrs. Alderton, what you're describing is fraud, misrepresentation, and potentially identity theft. And if we can prove the signatures on these disclosures were obtained under false pretenses, this opens doors you may not even realize exist." I exhaled slowly. "What do we do first?" "We compare everything," she said. "Every statement, every signature, every date. And we request bank subpoenas." Over the next 2 weeks, I became intimately familiar with the sound of my scanner. I provided every document Lila requested, old emails, text messages from the probate period, copies of the will, even the yellow legal pad where I had written questions that no one had answered at the time. Lila worked quickly, her updates arriving with steady confidence. The subpoenas were granted. Bank records were pulled. Transfer histories were mapped. Then, one afternoon, she called me with a tone I'd never heard from her before, something almost triumphant. "Margaret," she said, "we found the routing chain. The funds moved from your dormant account into Trevor's holdings. Then into an investment portfolio under a trust. And now, this is the interesting part, they've been sitting untouched for years." "Untouched?" I asked. "Untouched," she repeated. "If he had spent the money, this would be a different situation legally. But the fact that he maintained it, hid it, essentially preserves the evidence." My heart began to beat harder, steadier. "Do we have enough?" I asked. "For a civil claim?" "Easily," she said. For criminal charges? Potentially. But first, I think it's time we invite them to a conversation. A confrontation? No, she replied coolly. An opportunity for them to tell the truth. People often reveal more when they think they're still in control. I closed my eyes, letting her words settle like embers catching fire. I was no longer the woman they thought they could deceive. And soon, they would learn exactly what that meant. I spent the night before the meeting in a quiet state of resolve. No pacing, no anxiety. Just a stillness that felt almost ceremonial, like I was preparing to bury something long overdue. I made tea, wrapped myself in the shawl Charles once gave me, and allowed the weight of the truth to settle without crushing me. In the morning, I dressed deliberately, nothing dramatic, simply a navy blouse and a slate gray jacket. Clothes that said, I am not here to be pitied. I am here to be heard. The meeting was arranged at Lila's office. When I arrived, Emily was already seated, hands folded too tightly in her lap. Benjamin stood near the window, arms crossed, pretending to admire the skyline. Trevor sat with calculated calm, leaning back in his chair like a man confident in his ability to control the room. He wouldn't control this one. Lila entered last, placing 3 envelopes on the table before taking her seat. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice smooth and firm. Today is an opportunity for clarity. Nothing more. Trevor smiled politely. We're always happy to help Margaret understand the estate paperwork. It was a complicated time. Lila returned his smile with a predator's softness. Indeed. Which is why the bank records we subpoenaed have been very illuminating. The color drained slightly from Emily's face. Benjamin shifted, suddenly restless. Trevor's smile thinned. Subpoenas? For what reason? For the account you failed to disclose, Lila said. She tapped the envelope lightly. The account opened under Margaret's social security number. The one you transferred funds from, directly into your personal holdings. Every syllable landed with surgical precision. Emily's voice cracked. Trevor, you said everything had been settled. His jaw clenched. Everyone calmed down. But no one was calm. Lila slid the envelopes across the table. Inside, you'll find documented transfers, routing numbers, and probate filings that omitted required disclosures. You will also find a notice of intent to pursue civil action for recovery of assets, damages, and legal fees. We are providing you the courtesy of reviewing this before it is formally filed. Benjamin broke first. I didn't know, he muttered. I swear, I didn't know. Emily spoke next, voice trembling. Trevor, tell them this isn't what it looks like. Trevor glared at me, finally revealing the truth he had kept buried under pleasantries all those years. You weren't supposed to find that account, he snapped. It was meant to be closed. It was nothing. Practically abandoned. Then why take money from it? I asked quietly. His face twitched. Because Charles intended it for the family, his blood family. Not for me? I finished. His wife? He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. In that silence, the betrayal became fully visible. Lila leaned forward. You made a serious miscalculation, Mr. Alderton. You assumed Margaret would remain passive. But she is now fully prepared to proceed. I held Trevor's gaze. I am. Something fractured in his expression, not fear, not yet, but the realization that his certainty had just collapsed under its own weight. This was the turning point. I was done being quiet. The aftermath unfolded with the slow, methodical precision of a well-set trap. Within days, Lila filed the civil complaint. Trevor received notice of the investigation into identity misuse. His investment accounts were frozen pending judicial review, a detail that seemed to shake him far more than any confrontation in Lila's office. Suddenly, the man who strutted through financial jargon with effortless arrogance found himself answering questions from auditors who possessed neither patience nor sympathy. Emily's polished composure deteriorated quickly. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she had temporarily moved into her sister's home because, as she reportedly put it, Trevor has ruined everything. The marriage that once projected such self-assured unity now showed fractures wide enough for anyone to see. Benjamin kept his distance, calling once with a halting apology that felt less like remorse and more like an attempt to stay clear of the legal fallout. I didn't offer him comfort. The era of making others feel at ease at my own expense was over. Meanwhile, Lila's documentation grew into a case file thick enough to need its own binder. Every subpoena, every verified signature discrepancy, every transfer record built a narrative that no one could spin away. And the most damning piece was one I hadn't expected, a recorded email chain from years earlier in which Trevor advised Emily that the secondary account will remain undisclosed to expedite inheritance division. Those words alone ignited the entire case. Negotiations began. Trevor's lawyer, a man with the permanently harassed look of someone used to cleaning up expensive messes, reached out with an offer that amounted to little more than an insult. We rejected it. The second offer was marginally better, but still insufficient. Then came the third, delivered with the urgency of a man who finally grasped the magnitude of his own downfall: full repayment of the stolen funds, adjusted for interest and delayed access, coverage of all legal fees, and a signed statement acknowledging misconduct. He would avoid criminal charges only if he complied completely. The silent downfall of a man who once strutted confidently through every financial conversation in my presence was strangely anticlimactic. There was no shouting. No dramatic collapse. Just a steady erosion of certainty, confidence, and reputation. When the settlement was finalized, Emily emailed me a single sentence: "I hope someday you can forgive us." I didn't reply. Forgiveness is not a demand, it is an offering, and one earned over time, not requested in haste. Trevor, however, sent nothing. His silence was the truest confession he could give. As I signed the final legal documents, I felt no triumph. Only a quiet, enduring justice, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. The kind that speaks for itself. When the settlement funds finally arrived, the transfer notification felt almost surreal. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had mapped out the bank statements, where I had cried quietly the first night after Charles's death, where I had eaten countless dinners alone, and I let the moment settle into my bones. Justice, when it arrives late, carries its own heaviness. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I reflected on the years I had spent believing I was being cared for by people who viewed me only as an obstacle. On the way grief had made me trust too easily. On how betrayal can hide itself behind polite smiles and carefully worded condolences. But alongside those reflections came something unexpected: relief. Not just because the financial wrong had been corrected, but because the truth had been fully unearthed. Deception thrives in darkness. Once brought into the light, it loses its power. I used a portion of the recovered funds to renovate the house, nothing extravagant, just repairs and improvements that had long been postponed. Fresh paint. New windows. A garden path lined with stepping stones I laid myself. Each change felt symbolic, a way of reclaiming the space my life occupied. I also made a small donation to the community center where I volunteered, requesting the funds support women learning financial literacy. If I had known more years earlier, if I had felt empowered to question, to verify, to demand clarity, maybe I would have uncovered the truth sooner. But life unfolds as it must, not always as we wish. One afternoon, while pruning the rose bushes, I realized something remarkable: I no longer felt anger. The betrayal no longer weighed on my chest. I had pursued justice and obtained it without sacrificing my integrity. My revenge had not been loud or destructive. It had been thoughtful, measured, ethical, a reclamation rather than a retaliation. And with that realization came a quiet peace. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need them to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. I didn't need them to feel guilt or shame. What mattered was that I had become the guardian of my own truth. What mattered was that I had restored what they thought they could take from me: my security, my dignity, my voice. And in doing so, I rediscovered the version of myself that grief had once buried. The woman who endures. The woman who sees clearly. The woman who rises. I have lived long enough to know that justice rarely arrives wrapped in certainty. More often, it appears after long nights, deep breaths, and the steady courage to face truths that frighten us. But if this journey taught me anything, it is this: betrayal thrives on silence, but justice thrives on persistence. We are conditioned, especially as women of my generation, to avoid confrontation. To trust others to manage the details. To assume that questions are impolite and scrutiny is ungracious. But the truth is simple. Silence protects the liar, not the betrayed. If you take nothing else from my story, take this: keep your records. Ask your questions. Follow your instincts even when others dismiss them. And when something feels wrong, shine light on it. Paperwork is not merely ink on a page, it is a history waiting to be read. For years, I believed that being agreeable was the same as being kind. But I've learned that real kindness begins with holding yourself accountable to your own worth. It begins with refusing to let others diminish your place in the world simply because they believe you will not resist. Justice did not return my husband to me. It did not repair the family fractures that existed long before I arrived. But it did restore something equally precious: my belief that truth has weight, and that even those who think themselves clever cannot outrun it forever. I share this not out of bitterness, but out of hope that someone listening, someone who feels small or dismissed or uncertain, will find strength in my words. You are never too old to fight for the truth. You are never too late to reclaim what is yours. And sometimes, the most powerful revenge is the quiet, measured, inevitable restoration of your dignity. Thank you for listening.